we're going to begin. I will try to pad this till the rest of the students show up, although I just joked that this is now my desire, a school with all faculty and no students. So, don't look at me like that, Brian. So, here it is. Rogers, we got it. Let's see. I will try to make this brief. We are very pleased and happy to have Ed Mitchell with us this evening. I will make this brief for a number of reasons. First of all, because Ed is going for the Bucky Fuller record for lecture time. So I'm going to make this really short, so he has some of that time for himself. I think he's about 3,000 inches. Is that right? Also because Ed has been here many times. You've known him from conferences and symposia, Wednesday episode, and lots of reviews. So Ed needs a little introduction here. And also finally because, as I said with John tomorrow, most of the things, when John was here, I said I couldn't actually relay anyway. In Ed's case, it's because they go so far back in the REPRISE circumstances that I actually don't even remember them. I will stick to the facts because anything else is going to get us into trouble. Ed is an adjunct professor at Yale University School of Architecture and has previously taught at Columbia, IIT, and Pratt. Recipient of the Architectural League of New York's Young Architects Award. He is the principal of Edward Mitchell Architect and a fellow of the Urban Design Workshop in New Haven, where his work spans from residential and retail projects to large mixed-use redevelopment proposals. And he's also collaborated with Coder and Kim and Associates on planning for a new sector of Abu Dhabi. Before opening his own office, Ed was a project architect with Eisenman Architects, where his projects included one of our favorites here, the big baggy pants of the Max Reinhardt house in Berlin. Oh, we're going to see it? His writings on architecture have appeared in Any Assemblage, Log, Perspecta, The Village Voice, among other publications, and his projects recently have been featured in Fast Forward Urbanism, edited by Roger Sherman and Dan Cuff, and the forthcoming Formally Urban, both of those from Princeton Architectural Press. Ed is also a member of Vita Nueva? New Life, whatever. A collaborative of environmental engineers, financial experts, and designers involved in the redevelopment of environmentally impacted properties, including the long-term planning of 16,000 acres of coal mines in Pennsylvania, which I assume is what boring has to do with. But no sweater vest, right? Just because you're in a cold country, you have to wear a sweater vest. It's good. Finally, on a personal note, I hold Ed responsible for dragging me into architecture 30 years ago at Brown. And then 10 years after that, we served as co-editor with Sarah Whiting and Greg Lynn of Princeton's journal Fetish, which is to say that you can't do good things like reclaim coal mines all the time in your career, and sometimes you make mistakes, for which others are now paying. Through Ed's early example, I thought architecture was a field where pulling together the most idiosyncratic and incommensurate material and somehow making a convincing story and world of it was effective architecture. And it wasn't until I was too late in the field that I realized that those possibilities had more to do with Ed than they had to do with architecture itself. But by then it was too late. I think effortlessly, Ed can move from references to poet Wallace Stevens to sportscaster Jim McKay, from Isaac Newton, Sir Isaac Newton, that one, to Nancy and Sluggo, from post-minimalist art to the latest George Clooney movie, Kafka to Iggy Pop and the Psychedelic Furs. There's a method to this madness, as Ed systematically uses popular culture to stake out terrain for unpopular, or at least not yet popular, positions in architecture. He exhibits the dangerous combination of a deep insider knowledge of architecture with a perpetual attitude of the outsider, which is the only place to be if you want to move beyond the cliche alternatives of worlds that we usually inhabit. As we were discussing with Andrew Zago the other day here, Ed's interest as well is in how one can combine the market with the discipline, and all of his work in some way, I think, engages our preoccupation with new audiences, but also with the political economy of design. And trying to short-circuit the distance between the popular and the expert, We've assumed here that we were making a contribution to building a school with a new attitude to the discipline, but maybe in retrospect, we've really been making a school that only Ed can appreciate. Please join me in welcoming our audience of one, Ed Mitchell.
Well, there's really no need for me to do a talk at this point. We covered everything, and you can see a lot of what we talked about. So, as Bob said, I warned him this could go a little long because a lot of it is new material, but it's also part of a 30-year dialogue that the two of us have had together. So you'll have to forgive me for going through that again. You also have to forgive me that my glasses are such. And Bob, what was he did was set me up by printing this at about 50% so I can't read my own text. So I'd like to, the other person I'd like to acknowledge is Dr. Rothler, who Bob and I have always had a kind of home together in our arguments that started in Providence, something like this. Let me read that. But Doug was always the person for, I think, all of us who made the somewhat ubiquitous, plain, boring fields of Illinois seem like an interesting place and really made Chicago a home for a lot of us. So I had to do this embarrassing. I noticed this is from back in the day. And the only reason I show this is that's obviously me, I think, on the right, and Bob on the left. But
you are wearing a sweater.
Exactly. I said, I'm going to call that. I said, it's more embarrassing to me because who the hell would wear a vest on a beach? But this was over some trivial thing, but they could catch us both in the middle of an argument. And it was Bob patiently listening to me pontificate. As he mentioned, the other thing, just as a reprise, and this is talk in some way, is a bit of a return to the Guerrilla Farmer's Almanac. In one of the great things, when I got Bob into architecture, helped get him teaching gigs and all that kind of stuff, Bob, in one of his capers, invited me to write for Log with my old boss as the editor, and promptly we were kicked out of the inner circle for what we had said. And what I believe I wrote was, let me go to the story of this image. A farmer clears the ground before establishing a field. Once the field is established, the farmer will use an almanac to forecast futures. Logging or ground clearing may be required in order to clear the field for the almanac. Modernism relied on ground clearing. We can now work with greater complexity. One thing is clear, logging lists facts, while an almanac, which contains logs, aims towards a production. A log records while an almanac produces. But in 2005, who would have predicted what would happen in the following years? A 50% collapse in the value of Wall Street. Citizen marches on Washington. England turned into a feral woodland, and the Houses of Parliament turned into a manure store. Electric cars, shopping and warehouse clubs, rooftop gardens. Canada finally conquered. Love meters to detect emotions and rampant vegetarianism. Death taxes enacted, the entire range of human knowledge embodied in a computational machine which can draw graphs and give calculations for shapes, euthanasia of the sick, the legislation of mediocrity, and by God, of all things inconceivable, a super Amazon race with women as presidents. While this sounds like it was ripped from recent headlines, and I should say it's probably hard to rip from headlines these days, you can only, I guess, download them. These fantasies are in fact pulled from late 19th century utopian literature. The period was characterized by the first phase of urbanization, spurred on by technical innovation, increases in productivity, and a large-scale population growth and migration. And similar to today, the volatility of production was commonly followed by economic depressions. The Panic of 1873 to 79, which was caused by the collapse of the railroads, which had been subsidized by the government, and 25% of them went bust. The Panic of 1894, this is Coxley's armies march on Washington, where unemployment was at 18.4%, due in large part from foreign distress due to banking runs. And the bankers' panic, causing such things as the Pullman strike and the incident of the Haymarket Fair. And also, and then in 1907, the bankers' panic of 1907, where the stock market dropped 50% in anticipation of the Great Depression much later. So such cultural instability was a cause of both dystopic and utopian narratives of the period. The most significant of these was John Matney's The Diathos, A Far Look Ahead of 1883, Richard Jefferies' After London or Wild England of 1885, William Morris's Views from Nowhere of 1890, Anna Bowman Dodd's The Republic of the Future of 1887, Edward Bellamy's Looking Backwards of 1888, which was the third largest selling novel, I believe, of the 19th century, New Amazonia by Elizabeth Burgoyne Corbett of 1889, in a reversal of the futuristic speculation, Mark Twain's A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court of 1890, John McCoy's A Prophetic Romance, Mars to Earth of 1896, and William Dean Howell's A Traveler from Alturia from 1892-93. Howell's book, critical of Gilded Age society, takes place in a New Hampshire hotel, where several stock characters, a banker, a journalist, an industrialist, and others encounter a visitor to their vacation resort who regales them with tales of a utopian society where work days are reduced and labor is done out of altruism rather than through either a desire for material gain or forced labor. Without selfish desire, Alturia's capital exists not as a political center, but as a concentration of the arts. Altruria lies somewhere in the models of New England itself and its old utopian ideals, culled from the Shakers, the Moravians, and experiments like Brook Farms in Massachusetts, where Nathaniel Hawthorne was a very short resident. Home is the heart of Altruria in its system, and the usual stock and trade of futuristic science fiction, electric transportation, racial and sexual equality, and the like, while idealistic, are nevertheless greeted with ridicule by the House guests. One character, the seasonally abandoned wife of the Wall Street broker, finds the stranger's story not only preposterous, but slightly upsetting. Not only does she frown on the making of the mixing of classes, but finds the tale slightly offensive to what she sees as the upper class's paternal duties to uplift the working class. She considers the city folks' patronage to be the fiscal savior of the otherwise destitute community and brings books to the local family of impoverished farmers. However, the young son lashes out at her, claiming that her kind had not saved them from ruin, but had been the cause. Their speculative practices forced the sale of the family farm and tied them to a lifetime of servitude. Georgia Cucci suggests that the model belatedly inspired Frank Lloyd Wright's Broadacre City nearly 40 years later, a plan which Rem Koolhaas famously called the only new idea of urbanism in the 20th century. In most of these novels, the narrator invariably wakes up from a long sleep and in a dream state required for planning and pits competing ideas about America's future. But by the late 19th century, the city had become a manifestation of the emerging powers of industry and the possible threat of empire, while counterforces sought to preserve the Jeffersonian agrarian ideal and Calvinistic impulses against excess. But beyond both movements, moralizing tendencies, is the de-urbanizing movement which interests me today. Here we begin to see the emerging informalism of contemporary urbanization and the appearance of homo ludens, the man of play, free to move through a new cosmopolitan space as the evolutionary ancestor to the noble farmer, the productive laborer, and the upright citizen of the past. Our society is one that does not tolerate limits. In the 1896 election, it was seemingly a standoff between banking interests and the common man, in an earlier version of Wall Street versus Main Street. That struggle characterized the two presidential candidates, the boring politician William McKinley, supporter of the banks, and the ecstatic populist blatherskite William Jennings Bryan, who was accused by the New York Times of not having appropriate manners for the public sphere. In fact, it is said by some that it was William McKinley's lack of charisma that got him elected. In the 1896 Cross of Gold speech at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, Bryan famously intoned, "You come to tell us that the great cities are in favor of the gold standard. We reply that the great cities rest upon our broad and fertile prairies. Burn down your cities and leave our farms, and your cities will spring up again as if by magic. But destroy our farms, and the grass will grow in the streets of every city in the country." While Bryan summoned the mythic American farmer to rise up against the increasing powers of urban speculators, ironically, the farmer was the cause of the fiscal turmoil. One Once self-sufficient, farmers began making use of increased technological innovations to increase productivity, which gave access to larger markets. Farmers were encouraged to take on debt to buy new equipment and seed, as well as farm single crops explicitly destined for the market. With the deflationary trends in the currency due to the adherence of the gold standard, the values of the farmers' debts increased while the price of crops decreased, often forcing foreclosure. The myth of this narrative is that the yeoman farmer only existed in New England, whereas the South was run by sharecroppers in the West, that is Kansas, Nebraska, and Colorado, were sustained by unusual climatic conditions during the previous generation, is largely sponsored by the large-scale infrastructure of rail. With no central bank, the money supply in New York City fluctuated due to cash supplies given to farmers during the harvest season, which habitually caused interest rates to rise, which then attracted foreign investment that took advantage of those higher interest rates. The architectural implications of this struggle manifest in contested notions of the public. On one hand, urbanization in major industrial centers, an equally ideological alternative, tended towards disurbanization, exemplified in both Soviet avant-garde experimentation and less polemically, but more effectively, in the horizontal growth of American urbanization, anticipating Rem Koolhaas's remark, relief, it's over. That is the story of the city. The city is no longer. We can leave the theater now. What is the theater that we are leaving? Public institutions formulate discourses. A discourse is made up of two parts, its speakers and its audience. For an architecture school, the shaping of that discourse is the activity which forms from the education of young architects, but is also the formation of an audience for what is to a large degree an internal discussion. This conceptual link between language and the city is difficult to overcome. This system of the city structure, primarily military and defensive, Graham Shane writes, of walls and taboos, is built into the structure of the English language. Sebastiano Serlio's 5 Books of Architecture exemplifies the kind of urban network divided and articulated into discrete theatrical setting, for in descending order, the noble or tragic city, the comic city or the city of the marketplace, and the satiric or pastoral city with their corresponding discourses. Serlio's urban system is urbane. Its inhabitants of its various cities should demonstrate good manners, an ability to follow appropriate discourse and put things in their proper place, no matter whether they are city sophisticates or country squires. To do otherwise, to mix up behaviors and syntax, would be to demonstrate improper behavior like some rustic country cousin or act like the blatherskite Brian. However, one must wonder, does the satiric citizen show good form? Note that the 3 cities are bound together by a road, running down the center of each perspective, signaling the emergence of a consecutive network that will ultimately undermine their distinct identities. In the noble and comic cities, the paved roads grid positions buildings, giving them order and meaning. But on closer inspection, the satiric city's gridded road reads either as chunks of sod cut and removed in anticipation of construction, or as the broken fragments of an antiquated paving system. The satiric city sits ambiguously on the brink of urban development or its aftermath, a fitting stage for the inhabitation suspended between culture and more base animal passions of the world of the satire. Even to more properly civic sister cities, the proper civic sister cities show signs of decay. Trees grow from the roofs of the noble city, which might devolve towards the slippery exchange of signs in the comic city, or fall back into the erotic hybridity of the satiric city. We will return to this idea later in the talk. Unlike Serlio's theatrical paradigms, Ebenezer Howard's diagram for a group of slumless, smokeless cities from tomorrow, a peaceful path to real reform, describes what a city ought to be. A polycentric urban network of cities, towns, and farms connected by rail, canals, and roads, as well as institutions that fall outside the expected concerns of the rational planner. Homes for waifs and inebriates, epileptic farms, and insane asylums are all cast outside the network. For George Orwell, the tedious denizens of the guarded city, who he called creeping Jesuses, have been justifiably banished to the fringes. While Serlio's notion of a city was proprietary, urbanism is not. Urbanism is not a place, but a system. And that system should not be equated with a city proper, as it has the capacity to break down structural interpretations of discrete architectural types, while it is potentially destructive of city form and a motivated relationship of linguistic signs. There are discrepancies on how we teach urbanism, which has been the focus of the last 12 years of my teaching at Yale. City making is the culmination of most architectural programs. Of the dominant discourses in American architectural education, there are three that I will address. The first, the École des Beaux-Arts, is a paternal discourse which operates by having professionals pass on the language of architecture to the student in support of a dominant cultural institution. That system is predicated on invention within a set of received conventions, and it's producing architects as cultural agents while it's producing an audience made up of the pre-existing institutions who depend on cultural memory and laws. The second system, the Bauhaus, which I'll use as a modernist description, based on a different idea of the role of the architect as a kind of master craftsman or technician, whose audience is actually mass markets made up of the proletariat and industrialists. The third, the UT Austin Cornell School, operates as a critical discourse, where the cultural critic is the role of the architect, and his audience, by and large, other architects. In relationship to the city, the classical model of the city is a representational system that demonstrates the state's systems of power. Parts conform to the greater whole, and that cities conceived like a large building with all its elements taking their proper place. Hierarchy is formed around the figure of the public space, which stands out from the working fabric. The public is an idealized space which we enter. In the modernist city, public space does not exist as such. Rational solutions of smaller concrete problems like a single-family house can be extrapolated and multiplied to reach the scale of the city, but it would be more proper to call the modernist city, like Howard's diagram, as urban rather than civic. One might recall John Dewey's argument that a public does not exist until a negative externality calls it into being. Modernism, in its idealized form, would posit technological solutions that would eradicate the motivation for public space, the scene of conflict and resolution. The Cornell School program is critical of the utopian sensibilities of both the classical and modern urban paradigm, acknowledging on one hand the suspect nature of such dominant political ideologies, but also recognizing the dynamic nature of both the contemporary metropolis and the cultural at large. If Howard's urbanist approach has its unfortunate dullness in the diagram, Koolhaas would be critical of these incompatible fragments of uniqueness as an outmoded reprisal of the older practice of urban design. I've had the privilege or pain of working with two of the best students of that last pedagogy, Fred Coder and Peter Eisman. And to evaluate their respective positions within the modernist paradigm, one can see that both operate within the scenes of the city. For Eisman, the critique of modernism and its ideology results in an autonomous formal language that undermines both the classical and modernist tropes. In these two projects, one can see the result of that discursive project. In Frankfurt on the left, the seed lung, the rationalist German housing type, is subjected to distortions and interrogation resulting in formal invention. And in the Reinhardt house, the metaphor of a crystal architecture is turned back on the city of Berlin. Reinhardt erupts within the city as a distorted cultural metaphor. Its topologic form produces an unresolved hole in the middle of Berlin. For Coder, the problem, despite its own formal inclinations, lies in the formation of a whole through W-H-O-L-E, through composition. In opposition to the seamless fabric of the modern city, Coder finds that the collision of architectural forms, demonstrated best in the EU model on the right, is within it a texture emerges between its figurative elements. At the edges of strong imperial forms, in the seams of the collage,
is the area of the city where actual urban vitality might exist. In substituting urban design for planning, Collage City is consciously reactionary vis-a-vis modernism, returning to Serlio's notion of urban design as a series of discrete set pieces. However, a closer read points in other directions. The crisis of the object, just me and Fred in the project we did in Abu Dhabi that was referred to earlier, that chapter begins with 3 quotes from Emerson. Cities force growth and make men talkative and entertaining, but they make men artificial. From Jefferson, I think our government will remain virtuous as long as they are chiefly architectural. And Ortega y Gasset, but how can man withdraw from the fields? Where will he go? Since the earth is one huge unbounded field, quite simple, he will mark off a portion of this field by means of walls, which set up an enclosed finite space over against amorphous, limitless space. For in truth, the most accurate definition of an urb and a polis is very like the comic definition of a cannon. You take a hole, wrap some steel wire tightly around it, and there's your cannon. That last quote, one notes, is reminiscent of Carl Andre's similar quote, a thing is a whole and a thing it is not. One can conclude from the above quotations that in using the canon to establish a canon, the quote might read in combination, a city is a whole in a field, the repetitious, seamless, functional, determinist, modernist grid, for garrulous artifice. Somewhat surprisingly, though, that one, Eisenman, was projected as a radical, a hole puncher, and the other, Coder, more conventional, a hole patcher, the formal outcome can be similar. Both interrogate the ground. Eisenman questions the architecture's philosophical underpinnings, destabilizing representational systems. Coder's belief is that the ground, the situation of architectural deployment and production, is so complex and contested that no typological solution is sufficient to describe the possible architecture or urbanity. This struggle the struggle to resuscitate discourse, though, can be a conceptual tract. My early work, like the work done for architecture theater, work with poor neighborhoods in New Haven, was concerned with discursive and sometimes conflicted issues. You can see in the map on the left is the original 9-square plan of New Haven, in which it was an idealized society. On the right, a drawing from the 1930s of one of Rotival's plans for the city, where it's been quartered, and represented as a series of discrete pods. Our goal was to try to then take a new order that would tie some of those events together. In drawings like this were done as some sort of cinematic narratives of actual walks you could do in New Haven, and using the drawing technique to make formal links between different objects to forecast possible architectures. This one for the watering hole, which was for a large commercial market in a kind of decrepit part of the city, and this for that still part of that same system, a smaller version of a project we were requested to look at for a watering hole or spa against the park. Despite a continued interest in the project, I became more interested in the quantitative values of city making. If one wanted to produce specific urban form, I wondered, what was the proper mix of programs and populations that might make a proposal viable? Howard, for example, shows the population and acreage required to organize everything from allotments and factories to insane asylums. Graphically, we can represent the central city population and the agricultural lands, something like this, so that when Le Corbusier shows a city for 3 million, we assume that a new density and intensity of city making prevails. On the contrary, the core of the plan actually houses only 1 million, with a green belt that surrounds it before it turns into a relatively low-density series of garden apartments. When compared to Howard, it turns out that the same statistical model is being deployed. For Frank Lloyd Wright, there appears to be a less dense urban system. If we tiled Broadacre City to the same regional scale as the Villa Reduce, it turns out that both schemes would support the same ratio of agriculture to population. Only the formal ideology shifts. from a plan of a centralized business district to one organized by the family farm unit. Architecture, as Rem Koolhaas stated, is tangible and concrete, whereas urbanism is ideological, falsely satisfied, falsified needs, as he put it, like the advertising propagated around Coca-Cola. Following the latent premise of Howard's diagram, many of modernism's attenuated or diffuse urbanisms, Frank Lloyd Wright's Broadacre City, the disurbanist plans and Ludwig Hilbersheimer's suburbanization of Chicago, never reconstituted dense core or remained politically revolutionary and fundamentally architectural. They recognized that new forms of transportation and energy might allow the city to be redefined by temporal rather than spatial dimension. Wright depicted an agrarian refuge from the hoarding, predatory tendencies of Wall Street. Characteristically, such revolutionary projects require that the orders of the corrupted noble city be abandoned, opening up conceptual space between functional determinism and the moribund Searlean signifiers. The urbanite is reconstituted in Wright's formalized warp and web of a new organic architecture in Hilbersheimer's underlying faith in scientific bureaucratic management. And so, the criticism is correct. The stadium in Broadacre empty stands are not accidental. The void is a predictable occurrence in an urbanism that essentially rejects public space. The utopian aspirations of these attenuated urbanisms remain subject to Desserteau's critique of the ideology of the concept city, which he defines as an operation that produces its own space unpolluted by the past, a synchronic system that contrasts to tradition, and a universal subject. The concept city has no interference with contradictory spatial or political logics. The contradictions of late capitalist concept cities is the inherent mutability of the pieces occupying the grid supported in capitalism's conquest. Sorry about that. In capitalism's conquest, capitalism's apparent requirement to eliminate the strict logic of any plan. Ultimately, the result is the breakdown of discrete linguistic models. Richard Neutra, it might be noted, whose Rush City drawings I'm showing here in the 1920s, conjured up visions of a contemporary automobile metropolis, but was disappointed to find that when he arrived in Chicago, American cities were at that time less Wrightian and either more conventionally hierarchical or formless entities with no visible ordered logic. Despite the limitations of rational methods to construct American cities, let's examine Wright and Neutra's desert disurbanist heritage. If we can arrange the pieces any way we want, the logical outcome are cities like this in Arizona, which, as it turns out, are organized around the retail throw of big box urbanism. As we see in the middle of one of these cities is something like a Target or something like a Walmart. A student of mine actually did a survey of all the market research of all these big boxes and counted the number of people living in these cities, these concentric circles, conform exactly to that market ratio. So clearly, in terms of ideology, how and what we consume has switched from food to other things in the generic city. I'll show you just very briefly, this kind of motivation was where we started doing work in Greenpoint in Brooklyn, trying to figure out how different programs correspond to a population needed to support it through statistical analysis of the census for New York City. So you see here, in this case, a supermarket is supported by 2,500 houses, which can take various forms. We then, with students starting this project, did a set of genetic algorithms. This is prior to all the new tools that do this. This was done pretty raw at the time, calculating different ratios of light and air to produce a somewhat rational system that would produce lots of variation within the system, and then got grant money to produce a very primitive version of SimCity, which had a series of housing typologies and populations associated. In that drawing, you see the yellow circles are actually tractors with throws for things like schools. And this model actually is live. I'm not going to show it to you in its full animation. It takes a while for it to run. But things grow and you can see different behaviors. As I said, the student state still doesn't actually show you what's interesting about it, which is actually the behavior of a city, which will tend to lurch if too many rules are put onto it. Whereas the fewer rules, the more synthetic is the growth of that particular city. That set of calculations was then simulated in a number of different models that you're seeing with different densities, and then we looked at how energy use and things like that might be calculated to make more efficient and more slightly exotic, taller buildings. Then looked at the support of those public programs and how local affiliations between programs might make more efficient urban logics, and then tiled that as a kind of game that we presented to a series of developers in New York. Another project I'll just show very briefly, this is for a competition which we didn't finish in the money in, for Reykjavik, was looking at the airport, which you see in that sketch on the right. They were going to move the airport out of there. We thought it was actually an interesting part of the city because it could get you to the hinterland, and people in the hinterland could get in the city to use the hospitals. We recognized that food production was valuable, and these kind of greenhouses that you see at the top being powered by geothermal heat might support the city. We looked at the size of a single circle of greenhouses and how much population it might support, and the lower diagrams show distortions of that circle relative to local circumstances. Then articulated the 4 different quadrants of the city, the research quads to the north, the residential quad to the southwest, and the kind of resort area where there's a thermal beach down to the southwest. Mapped these series of large greenhouses, some of which would be research facilities, but also would be pathways from the downtown down to the resort areas. And eventually that airport was supposed to slide further west. So the architecture was supposed to take on this kind of colossal scale that was reminiscent of the landscape itself, but a kind of technological research center for that city. And this is a big stadium over the sports complex, part of that larger winding system throughout the entire city. And of course, like everything else, Iceland ended in disaster. They couldn't do the kind of financial speculation, so we'd like to think if they had listened to us, at least they could have still been meeting. How many minutes? Beyond the Pale. 19th century utopian literature exhibits early signs of a bipolar national mania characterized by euphoric highs followed by bouts of depression. It is this American disorder, not its order, which challenges conventional approaches to urbanism. Or it might be said that our culture operates both psychologically and physically in chronic fits of ecstasy and boredom, or perhaps classic surly and formal theatricality followed by Howardian droning tedium of working out the kinks. Most of our cities, on the other hand, defy description or legibility, which often disqualifies them being recognized as cities, and which habitually causes architects great anxiety. With the kind of commissions I get, I am not working in teeny metropolitan centers, and so I've been forced to consider the limit conditions of thinking of the city. David Foster Wallace came closest to describing the circumstances of recent developments in our cultural bipolarism in his 2 great novels, Infinite Jest and The Unfinished Pale King. Infinite Jest is dedicated to the ecstatic pursuit of vitality at all costs and deploys techniques of reclaiming language from banality, while at the same time representing all the caveats, microthoughts, meta-moments, and other flickers of his hyperactive mind. In contrast, The Pale King grapples with the ecstasy's opposite, boredom as a literary form of penance for the excesses of the earlier work. The novel begins, no coincidence, in an Illinois ruined landscape of weeds and manure. I quote from the book. Past the flannel plains and blacktop grass and skylines of canted rust, and past the tobacco-brown river overhung with weeping trees and coins of sunlight through them on the watered-down river, to the place beyond the windbreak where untilled fields simmer shrilly in the morning heat, shatter cane, lamb's quarter, cutgrass, sawbriar, nutgrass, jimson weed, wild mint, dandelion, foxtail, spine cabbage, goldenrod, creeping Charlie, butterprint, nightshade, ragweed, wild oak, vetch, butchergrass, invaginate volunteer beans, all heads nodding in the soft morning breeze like a mother's hand on your cheek. Quartz and chert and schist and Klondike iron scabs and granite. Very old land. Look around you. The horizon trembling, shapeless. We are all of us brothers. Some crows come overhead, then 3 or 4. Not a murder, on the wing, silent with intent. Corn bound to the pasture's wire beyond which one horse smells at the others behind. The lead horse's tail obligingly lifted, your shoe brand sized in the dew, and alfalfa breeze, sock burrs, dry scratching inside a culvert, rusted wire and tilted posts, more simple of restraint than a fence per se, no hunting. The shush of the interstate off the past the windbreak, the pastor's crows standing at angles, turning up patties to get at the worms underneath, the shapes of the worms incised in the overturned dung and baked by the sun all day until hardened, there to stay, tiny vacant lines and rows and insect curls that do not close because head never touches tail. Read this. What is left after everything is complete? Koolhaas's generic city describes a boundless metropolitan medium of information distribution and easy pleasures that suggest that the conscription of programmed form is the living condition of architecture. The generic city is the nearly formless alternative made up of superficial histories and easy pleasures. Oops, sorry. Again, from Foster Wallace, who's much more suspicious of the generic city than Koolhaas may be. Wallace writes, to me, at least in retrospect, the really interesting question is why dullness proves to be such a powerful impediment to attention. The whole thing is pretty confusing and hard to talk about abstractly, but surely something must lie behind, not just muzak in dull or tedious places anymore, but now also actual TV and waiting rooms, supermarkets, checkouts, airport gates, SUV backseats, Walkmans, iPods, Blackberries, cell phones that attach to your head. This terror of silence with nothing diverting to do. I can't think anyone really believes that today's so-called information society is just about information. Everyone knows it's about something else way down. It may sound reactionary, but we're actually conscious of our rights as American citizens and the nation's responsibilities to us in ensuring that we get our share of the American pie. We think of ourselves as eaters of the pie instead of makers of the pie. So who makes the pie? That's not what your country can do for you, replies another voice. Corporations make the pie. They make it and we eat it. This is a project from Commando, which is a group I work with Doug Gaudier and Denise Hoffman-Brandt in Dallas, thinking about this. And this is for, just very briefly, looking at the problem of flooding in Dallas. They were trying to infill with a kind of new urbanist logic here. We thought that was a bad idea, that the open spaces of the city in its current kind of capitalist form were far more interesting, that you might network a series of green spaces to alleviate flooding in the river, thus causing a bounce up in the retail of the downtown areas, and planting and bringing back the Texas prairie as a kind of local ecosystem. We also recognize another kind of ecology of the high-rise building and these kind of spectacular hotel-like parcels that make kind of enclaves throughout the city. And then if we kept up with a kind of big urbanism, we could spot these things opening up the ground plane and producing a building that we actually formed like this as a new housing structure, a city inside of a city, with a section that kind of talked about a lifestyle where evaporative cooling from the kind of marshlands and fields down below would bring cool air up through the building through evaporative cooling, and then things like swimming pools and stuff would support the lifestyles of a typical Dallas citizen. Frederick Jameson offered this useful description of the modern objects, which I will switch with the term cities to further the line of thought. When we examine cities, we find that they fall into two groups. One, new orders of perception, or the metaphysical project of the city, or new social consciousness, which arises in relationship to the perceptions of human material culture, or the social construction. Burdened with both duties, the urban architect can be working at cross purposes. The problem of the mindless drone of repetition and sameness the generic city solved also demands the ecstasy of new perceptions, which can be indistinguishable from the spectacle demands of consumer culture. Both conditions characterize the modern experience. Ecstasy and boredom seem to be part of the same general function. One is inconceivable without the other. The ecstatic requires the boring. Boredom does not come into use until the 18th century, but its source is now lost. The OED cites the phrase French bore, naturally suggests that the word is French in origin. Bore, or padding, triviality, or borer, to stuff or to satiate. might be thought of, but without assuming some intermediate link that these words do not quite yield the same required sense. Our demand for ecstasy is countered by the boredom of over-satiating ourselves or stuffing the world with newness. Here's the drone of disurbanism. Demolition, the demise of the industrial city of the late 19th and early 20th century. Democracy, anti-elite, suspicious of city culture. Decomposition, another formalism, distributed and horizontal. Dehumanizing, a critical surrender by softening the blow, by patting out the alternating conditions of the urban subject. Does the dismantling of form by way of ubiquitous urbanism augur the end of critical discourse? A city would only be outside of the urban if it fell outside of the broader concept city's values. It would be made up of those things that cannot be exchanged within the urbanizing system. But if in Howard's inclusive conceptual taxonomy, the inebriated and insane are relegated to the undifferentiated gaps of the network, his polycentric model seems outdated with the loss of distinction between town and country. The entropic nature of today's urban systems of warehouses, big box retail, landscapes of waste and low density, residential suburban growth is all inclusive. Former Northeastern professor and Illinois native Baker Brownell and co-author with Wright of Architecture and Modern Life felt that architecture alone had the unique capacity to unfold space in time, and that Wright's dynamic understanding of the city might point to a new paradigm. This is the mining project that Bob referred to earlier. Coming through on the eastern approach on I-80, the Luzerne Valley unfolds like a painting by Lucia Fontana, opening up the Appalachians as a crescent moon. Despite the presence of many towns and villages, the valley is a particular form of nowhere, which is characteristic of much of the American landscape. Scranton, the valley's largest city, is famous as the headquarters for the television's The Office, a comic take on the day-to-day mundane dramas of ordinary people employed in a dying paper industry. When Ren Koolhaas spoke of conceptual Nevadas, where all the laws of architecture are suspended, he was not envisioning conceptual Scrantons. The elimination of form can lead nowhere. We were asked to come up with a plan for 16,000 acres. Actually, it started as 500, and as the process unfolded, and I became more ambitious about the project, we took on the entire property in eastern Pennsylvania. You're looking at a kind of aerial photograph with the Susquehanna River on the top, and you can see the valley in green that we're working in, and you can see various kind of the big box buildings that are out there, and some of the, I'll show you up close what some of the minefields look like. While the pits of the Wyoming Valley produce the piles of many regional cities, today, the leveling of difference, the entropic forces unleashed in both landscape and architectural form necessitates new tools for understanding the post-industrial land pattern. The cities barely exist. All appears to be wasteland. However, though this seems to be nowhere, it is in fact the central location of a national trucking and distribution network that is one day's drive to most of the major cities in the eastern United States and Canada. Though non-sites like the mining properties have a physical presence, their morphologies, their forms, are situated outside conventional norms of both the visible, what can be seen, and the articulate, what can be said. This can banish them from the discussions of their form. Characteristic materials of the non-site, this is from that site that we're working on, once understood as byproducts of this city, like pits and piles, caterings and tailings, detritus and discards, resemble the spatial logic of the pre-conceptualized past. The intricate relationships of these substances, the earthiness of buildings, land, roads, nature, animals, and humans, bound together and enfolded, resemble Serlio's satiric city. Like the satiric city, these non-sites can appear traditional because their waste materials cannot be sorted, separated, translated, or readily exchanged. These satiric non-sites quite often are where the objects in its scene are now piled up and pitted, falling back into a second nature of decay. The concept city suppressed waste within its pure visual order, dissembling the excesses of the metropolis and its entropic systems to the rational forms of the city. But modernism in itself does not necessarily sanction the concept that drives modern architecture's urban form. Mies, for example, despite the ubiquitous use of the grid, never himself posited a utopia. Instead, the architecture opens up a new spatial and linguistic territory within the city. The establishment of a terrain vague, the space of the possible, marks the annihilation of urbane form. Alan Berger has gone so far as to suggest that these drawscapes, the waste spaces that I'm talking about, are not only necessary to the city, but where the terrain vague are with the terrain vague, they demonstrate the potential areas of future forms of urbanization. To move beyond current architectural impasse, we have to consider the open formal and political possibilities of what might be called non-concept cities. We do not have to look far to imagine what the form of a city without a concept would look like. In our present city, the city has disappeared and been replaced by ubiquitous urbanism. The formless horizontal expanse of sprawl and other wastelands are our political reality. We may not find Dewey's public conflict, but there are many contradictions in analyzing its formal qualities. One cannot avoid the obvious correspondence with the valley's landscape to Robert Smithson's slag heaps, cores, and rubble mounds, and other post-minimalist work. Like in the valley's landscape, these were distinctly contingent, marginal, temporal, and non-linguistic, or informs. Post-minimalist specific choices of materials, Alan Serrett's stains and snarls and tangles of electric wire, Robert Morris's piles of detritus, Eva Hess's slumping fugitive resin casts that failed to reproduce their molds, and Barry Lavau's freeform orchestration of felt cast-offs and individual parts like ball bearings, lead punches, paper towel rolls, and glass shards are all part of that landscape. As Rosalind Prass remarked, Smithson exhibited a formalism redeemed at the expense of modernism. Smithson's work oscillated between junk and text, courted both the nonsensical and the performative aspects of language. Prass remarked that he imagined a world that eradicated those distances that regulate the grid of oppositions or differences necessary to the production of meaning. But if satire was once synonymous with the pastoral, Smithson's terminology marked out temporal geological shifts. He referred to new tectonics, again taking the geological term maybe even from the Russians who actually use it as a term for their more radical political project. His films in particular, time is of the essence. He uses the conceptual and post-industrial landscape to destabilize identities, fixed locations, and sequential or linear notions of time. Smithson's literary and literal landscapes could not be read, but they could also be experienced. At any rate, the pastoral, it seems, he said, is outmoded. The gardens of history have been replaced by sites of time. Smithson's fascination with the non-site of waste and decay countered modernism's purity and postmodernism's timeless gardens of history. The non-site, effectively, is the limit of thought and language, and by inference, the city is a concept. In Smithson's estimation, entropic processes, systems that consider the temporal basis of form, threaten modernism's comic monuments to the point of collapse. He depicts Madison Avenue's glass boxes, the denizens of advertising and other madmen, not as strong, silent types, but as pathetic and comic figures, the dialectic entropic crystal twins to New Jersey's pitted wastelands. These buildings have also become accumulations of forms and words. Obviously, as an advertising center, that would be the case. Heaps of language themselves, piles of information emitting no signal, full of noise, overcome by static. Attenuated modern urbanisms like Broadacre City remain utopian and pastoral, but newer satiric urbanisms have emerged that stretch urban form to the point of disconnect or collapse. If Mies's architecture is predicated on a purposeful silence, these non-concept cities pointed out that a new terrain may emerge based on semantic pauses, hesitations, stutters, and rants. Nonsense and noise, which characterize this architecture, operate at the limits of comprehension and articulation. To be more specific, these temporal, and I quote, architectures are the product of weak signals, in the case of No Stop City, tangles of infrastructure, like the sea terminal at Brugge, or the Congress Expo at Lille, or the piling of excessive information, like the Zentrum or Kunst and Media Technology in Karlsruhe, or the library projects. Rather than pure representations of political ideologies, satiric proposals like these are symptoms rather than cures of cultural forces, and therefore are politically ambiguous while suggesting new urban subjects and temporal identities. For our proposal, satiric architecture exhibits at the limits of good form, ideally reproducing the delirium of the metropolis as opposed to the nobility of the city. Building forms appear as piles of material, arbitrarily stacked and nominally contained. We subscribe to Koolhaas's statement to ignore the problem of the new in favor of the more and the modified. What are non-concepts? Urbanizing Luzerne County's coal towns both demonstrates and requires an intensive phase transition. This might eventually engender an extensive new space whose scale would engage both the nebulous political territory of the displaced and fugitive populace and the defensive enclaves of lifestyle centers, retirement villages, and temporal institutional havens. The project will appear satiric to the formerly urbane. The form this space takes will entail something contradictory, non-concepts to consider, four of which I will outline here. These non-concepts are culled from the formal agenda of the art world in order to provide visual accompaniment and also mirrored by latent development in more attenuated urban situations. Those non-concepts would be the cumulative model, or what I call the Richter theorem number 1. The accumulation of light forms, in this case brush strokes as buildings, produces local order, recognizable urban-like clusters, that accumulates towards facsimiles of city without any overall order or governing concept other than proximity. Remember this, if you're not aware of this, painting is done from a postcard, so it's not even a real landscape of anything other than a representation, so twice removed in terms of its simulation. Specific materials, which could be ball bearings, plant materials, monads, shanties, or greenhouses, when set adrift, find local order through their material properties and local forces. The cumulative model is both a time-based notion of a city and a simulation of the city. Temporal landscapes, or Richter theorem 2, mechanical and unauthorized accumulation of material and forces, paint, plant matter, heat, and other raw materials that fill the duller expanses of landscapes and warehouses that supply the old city, results in lush fields of time-sensitive effects. And I might add that this is a painting that's produced through continually canceling out the previous mood. Koolhaas's bigness characterizes these techniques of saturation and folding. Borrowed concepts, in this case, the Burry theorem, where random acts, the tossing of pennies, can be organized and sorted out through overlaps of borrowed concepts like the grid to impose artificial appearances of order. And finally, everyone's favorite, scatters and fields, or distributions in contrast to clusters, which privilege diffusion over compression and simultaneity over sequence. These organizations are comprehended by moving bodies and offer no privileged positions or vantage point, resulting in a new conceptualization of the public realm. Just to pause, I know we're getting long here. This is particularly interesting to me. He's actually trained as an architect, and I've been haunted by his work for years because it seems like it's just been thrown on the floor, but there is very complex geometric orders to some of these systems and how he drops, which can only be understood if you move around the gallery. And this is the fourth, a related one, which is slightly different, where you have kind of local clustering rather than diffusion, which puts pressure on elements within the system. Terminal architecture, we're getting to the end. The valley is, as Smithson might have put it, the site of terminal architecture, of logical contradictions, the place where formal language confronts its limits. It's a crazy quilted enclave with no unifying image, political vision, or operative network, but also a node and national distribution network. The rugged geography of mountains and valleys that hindered westward expansion now causes telecommunication dead zones, but the valley is an important point of that other distribution system which I referred to earlier. You see what it looks like. That's actually the coal strikes of eastern Pennsylvania, so most of the settlement happened along those areas. And the Earth Conservancy is taking sites like the Cone Banks and trying to produce green fields, which I'm not going to get into, are kind of discrepancies on that policy. Just to kind of illustrate a diagram, in the black grid is the city of Nanticoke, which is an old mining town that once was 10,000 people, which has a center. And all the other black things that you see in there are either buildings or small little patch towns, which are little communities that are usually ethnically segregated. And the large gray area are all the old mining fields that are part of the brownfield. So it's a huge area, and you can see that the towns actually used to cluster around that void. We also get kind of strange juxtapositions like this. This is one of the distribution centers up against the community, and sometimes the buildings of these distribution centers, which typically have about 4 questionable workers working them, are as large as the entire communities next to them. So they're these kind of empty sort of social vessels within the system of the city itself. Their daytime, some of the commercial things that the clients we had, we're trying to avoid the big distribution warehouses so they don't bring many jobs, and actually bring pharmaceutical companies. So in the daytime, the populations of those job centers exceeds the population of the valley itself. So you get a kind of temporal kind of urbanity, much like the office tends to propose a new social order. I'll just run through this quickly. What we had tried to do is propose a couple of ways of understanding and representing the valley as a scaffold framework rather than an actual plan. So we noted that the central location of this area was important. You see the major roads in red, and then along that, spots that used to be stops along an old trolley system that linked all these communities back together. We've made reference numerous times in the presentation to Cedric Price's Potteries Think Belt as an idea of how to link all these things back together, and showed that the old community centers, these kind of traditional urban centers, might be reconstituted with small patterns. I'm not going to show you actually the architecture of that stuff. I'm just going to focus on the plan itself. We also did energy calculations to show that if you solar panel all the roofs of the big boxes, you can power the entire valley. And then just north of this, in the area that now is infamous for fracking in southern New York, this is just outside that geologic zone. To be quite honest, the people of Pennsylvania would have loved to find natural gas, but that coal strike is a completely different geological formation, so there's little chance of that happening. But they're growing biofuel farms, so we did part of our job was kind of advertise for this and got a couple people interested in purchasing large properties. This is a kind of important diagram. We show that the entire valley that is exactly the size of Central Park and is surrounded by a bunch of small schools. So that the idea that emerges from this is that big central void, which had been seen as a negative, could be reconstituted as some kind of wilder version of a sustainable development with new codes and buildings. We did a number of illustrations of other kind of looser concepts to get rid of the grid. Other kind of assemblages might fall into other patterns, and deployed some of those techniques I talked about earlier as ways of organizing the landscape. And our aesthetic differed from the green one. We were more, I'm showing this is a tulip field, obviously in Holland, but something that would be more like a Frank Stella landscape, of raking those gravel fields with a big box retail and produce a very different kind of landscape. And finally, this plan where the Central Park District scale was shown in various incarnations. So in this case, you see the big box distribution centers, which typically are scattered in a picturesque form. In this case, we used them as an edge binding system to that void, and then showed this in various incarnations where it was a total gravel field where it was reconstituted with single-family houses, linking the community college to the south and to the northeast, a campus with a golf course and some other large developments. And finally, Afterburn. This is a project that came out of that. They thought what we did was interesting enough that they commissioned us to look at a site they also own that has a mine fire. This is the famous one is in Centralia, which burns at excessive temperatures. But where we were, somebody in 1915 kicked over a gas lamp, and it burns to this day. So there's steam coming out of the ground at about 150 degrees, and they had to remove a whole neighborhood out of this area. And it threatens actually the highway. If it goes too far, it could collapse the whole thing. So this is Andy Madrell, my ex-student, beat me after the WPA. We were frustrated because this was an actual project. We were trying to get funded to do this. And so what we proposed was some engineers from Rutgers University and people from Bureau Hackle, there's a tapping system into these mines, and that's a cartoon of what actually happens in the lower parts of the coal beds. Those fires are burning, they jump around, so they're not consistently one place or another. But with taps generated every 400 feet in a structure that we propose that would take some of this technology that Bureau Hackle was developing, big wooden structures, that we make these giant bamboo umbrellas or root taps, these big flowers that would kind of plug into the heating coil system to run power to heat greenhouses up above. And these diagrams show that it would be a kind of an unpredictable sequence of where this would move, where you would do a grid tapping every 500 feet, find where the heat was, and then begin to zero in. And probably over a short period of time, that heat would move, so these structures had to be able to be picked up and moved along, but they would start to grow through the microclimates in the greenhouses, new environments there. As those things kept shifting, we figured that the structure that produced the greenhouses themselves would be grown in the greenhouse, so it's a kind of bootstrapping operation, and that the plant material and detritus would provide topsoil over and above the rest of this. Again, that's a description of the kind of migration of the green stuff as it would kind of creep along the valley and produce these large green commercial greenhouses, which had a plan that we would take advantage of the distribution center and looked at certain kind of plant materials. So we were proposing to grow orchids, which are a high market value flower. There are flower farms in the region. We thought with the heat source, we would extend the growing season, effectively tripling it, so that the thing would become more profitable. Those profits then in turn could be used in terms of sponsoring other public uses. And what I've said about this thing too, what's significant about it is eventually when we finish rendering it, that combination of the steam and the trail of the flower gardens, we thought would kind of paint a new landscape. And it should be said, this is a very different idea of public space, because no human being could actually enter this other than the people who work there, because it's effectively dangerous, but visible from I-80 quite a way, because it sits on the bank of a mountain facing into the highway. So it would have a new visible presence and a new iconicity for the valley. That's the overall drawing. You see kind of the scale of the little township. To the south, that's I-80 running through the territory there, that these kind of plastic greenhouse structures would start to drape over and start to produce a new green landscape adjacent to a mobile home park. Hoda, there's a thing we even got that down. Heroism. And I'll give David Foster Wallace the last word on this. Enduring tedium, this is from part of the book where one of the characters accidentally goes into an accounting class who's been a kind of slacker all his life and finds that the answer to all his quests are there in a button-down accountant who's a substitute at a Jesuit college at the time. The substitute teacher says, enduring tedium over real time in a confined space is what real courage is. Such endurance is, as it happens, the distillate of what it is today. In this world, neither I nor you have made heroism. Heroism. By which, he said, I mean true heroism. Not heroism as you might have known from films or the tales of childhood. You are now nearly at childhood's end. You are ready for the truth's weight to bear it. The truth is that the heroism of your childhood entertainments was not true valor. It was theater. The grand gesture, the moment of choice, the mortal danger, the external foe, the climactic battle whose outcome resolves all designed to appear heroic, to excite and gratify an audience. An audience. He made a gesture that I can't describe. Gentlemen, welcome to the world of reality. There is no audience. No one to applaud, to admire. No one to see. Do you understand? Here's the truth. Actual heroism receives no ovation, entertains no one. No one queues up to see it. No one is interested. He paused again and smiled in a way that was not one bit self-mocking. True heroism is you alone in a designated workspace. True heroism is minutes, hours, weeks, year upon year of the quiet, precise, judicious exercise of probity and cause, with no one there to see or cheer. To retain care and scrupulosity about each detail from within the teeming worm ball of data and rule and exception and contingency which constitutes real-world accounting. That is heroism. And I say to all you architects, and I get that there's not a lot of students here because I can chase anybody away. My advice to you is do the math and keep good numbers, stay on your toes. You'll need to create an audience. Wake up and get to work. Before I talk, that this would be like we got Tosh 2.0 jokes. That every joke he has is jokes inside of jokes. That essentially, that by the end of the whole routine, only one person is still laughing. So at least Bob is still laughing at some of the innuendos. Okay.
10 minutes worth of questions. I'll start. It takes so long to warm up. We don't have time for that. While we're thinking. I mean, if your proposal for the no-concept city, I mean, A should be understood as the fourth paradigm that you set out with Beaux-Arts, the Bauhaus, in Texas. And if the rest of the talk after that is the proposal for a new pedagogic approach to the city, it is the no-concept city, let's say, what are the, you flesh out the armature, in other words, what's the architect's agency and what's the audience? Or what's the, in the same way it was, for Texas it was cultural critic and audience of architects, like what is the, what's the rest of the proposal?
It is the question. So this is sort of new material in that regard, although it's part of an article that's being published by Syracuse University. If those paradigms worked, right, if the audience for classical architecture was a public that was assumed and that the knowledge was passed on, which still motivates most architectural production, and there was, in some aspects of modernism, a new audience proposed, which was known to as a certain constituency and identity, politics of a singular individual. And if the Texas Cornell Critical School only audience was itself, then I would agree with some of the tenets of this program is that any audience to be produced does not exist until the provocation of the architectural proposal is there, and then in that Dewey-esque fashion it becomes contested and therefore takes its place in the public and produces new audiences and dialogues. The non-formal aspect of it is tricky because, for the non-concept, because the important part of that 60s art was not that, and Rosalind Krauss wrote about this most articulately, is that it represented a new paradigm. It's off the Kantian paradigm of the concept in which you deliver. So you have something in your head and you put it down on paper or punch it up in the computer rather than produce through the act of making itself in some ways and reactions to that work. So that post-minimalist work, not the minimalist work per se, has that capacity. I think that it posited new paradigms of reading form, namely through music, through movement, and which goes back to some architectural principles I tried to allude to, and to new inventions and systems. So the thermodynamic models that Smithson talked about, where there's energy flows that have to be caught, that form is only, solid form is still moving, but in geological slow time frames, is a way of understanding how form might arise. So reading those kind of vectors to make a proposal for us has been the struggle to kind of keep consistent with that in terms of reading both real projects and competition work, in which we invariably say, you got the brief wrong, the real problem is X, not Y.
To push a little harder on the concept thing, is it primarily concerned with the question of means for producing urbanism? To push a little harder on the no concept city thing, do you think it's primarily about producing the means for developing the means for producing a kind of urbanism, or developing standards for kind of judging a valid urbanism, or thirdly, possibly a set of controls for at least being able to kind of engage the urbanism that exists?
It's a tricky question because on one level it would have no rules and no controls, and
calculations and working with real numbers to effectively illustrate certain principles behind color development. But even within those projects, I'd like to think they don't deliver the status quo. They try to find hybrids and new combinations within that. So those things aren't necessarily expected to come out through that process of working through that material, that something new emerges. It's also, I would say for myself, and I didn't want to go with this, it is an aesthetic project. It's a pointedly aesthetic project, which I think Koolhaas has done perhaps the best in certain of his work, where buildings are sort of ill-formed conglomerates or piles of different information. Your building at IIT, for instance, is nominally a box. It's a set of forces operating at the urban scale to produce high artifice and public entry on one side, a facade that's only understandable at the speed of the car on State Street, and a cheap backside for students on the other side, all kind of nominally just barely held together formally. And I said to the students here, that project, when it was done, I was writing an article on those pieces of napkin sketch, everybody else's scheme except that and Morton Phelps work on it. But we would have been failed at school at the time, right? No doubt. It had no compositional sense in the strict sense of the word. So it had a great deal of materiality and sort of presence of being part of today's aesthetic that made it, to me, a kind of interesting target for trying to identify what new work looks like or how we represent the present, not the past, the historic project, or the future, but what the actual conditions are today, which our cultures will operate on.
Sounds like standards.
What's that?
Sounds like standards.
But they were always involved, too. That's the trick.
Follow up on the idea of the lack of control. Maybe frame it with the idea that you're talking about urban populations, Franklin writes, like the idea of organizing urban population by agriculture, for instance, exemplified by Christine. And then you talk a lot about organizing urbanism through the logistics of marketing and big box distribution centers. One thing that we know now looking back is that the Franklin Lloyd Wright model is this model of each person essentially subsidizing their own life.
Right.
And what happened between this kind of post-war and the 80s of the public essentially owning everything and then starting to sell it off and privatizing and the deregulation that produced that large scale that happened. So to be more specific, the reason that the big boxes can operate so efficiently is that the public has bought for them this massive infrastructure they take for granted, and then essentially don't assume any responsibility for in terms of any maintenance, let's say. But I guess I'm wondering, in your conception of this kind of lack of control, doesn't that lead to a lack of public sphere? Even with your last project of trying to find the economy for the Pennsylvania people, with the growing of the daisies, I mean, that would also assume that there's legitimate logistical ability to get those things to market in some way, which I'm not sure how you're coming down on the idea of when does the public get involved economically and pay for something, and when does it just sell it off for a minimal profit, and then.
Let me see if I could take it step by step. I don't think I said that the post-war system was irrational. In fact, it's highly rational and highly calculated. So if it appears irrational, it's because it seems to defy the kind of formal description that is the inheritance of a discursive model in architecture. So in Wright's case, Wright's system is incredibly complex. Like money was like cabbage, it would rot after 2 years, so you couldn't even accumulate on your own plot of land, if you will. So it was very fundamentally medieval, let's say, without the serfdom attached to it. And the ambition of the citizen of that is everybody had to be Frank Lloyd Wright. Everybody had to be a unique genius creating their own artisanal cheeses. It's like Vermont, you know, basically what that amounts to. The consumer market marks, as we all, you know, it's almost a cliche at this point, a new kind of identity in, let's call it the public sphere of American life. It is no longer rooted in the family. It's what you buy and own determines who you are, right? So I think, though I probably be personally critical of that, I try not to be, because it is the way things operate and how most people, in part, assemble their identities. So it's in that case, then it seems to be clear that there is no public associated with that in the traditional sense, because the public is whatever the market is at the time. This is how we constitute it. What architecture has, I still like to think, is the power of provocation, that its intrusion into the systems of the real, its aesthetic project can produce new populations and new publics and identity. So it can produce audiences, as we just said. It's not that they're there. That's why I like that last quote from David Foster Wallace. It's not so much that there isn't an audience, if you don't count on it, it's not going to be there unless you put the work in for it to try to produce it. So in the case of the specific case that you're talking about with the mine fires, that was privately held land, 16,000 acres. I've actually worked in a bunch of company towns. So the idea that there was this public sphere is actually not true at all. I've had that discussion when I present that project at length. It does not represent little ideal communities. In fact, it was very much a union-breaking scheme to keep all those different ethnic groups isolated so they wouldn't form a public. And the mine is the pit in between, made sure that didn't happen. So the people who own that property are actually stewards of a public trust, but it amounts to about 12 people, a couple of engineers from IBM, who, out of altruism, did not turn it over directly to crass development of the golf course. Actually, there's a golf course planned at a really good firm in Pennsylvania that we did a reaction to. So they are trying to build a public constituency of that project by bootstrapping. So that little piece of land, which they can never turn into housing or marketing, the thought between us and them, they shared it, is it had to be something that couldn't be occupied, but that would produce some value. And that value would be public in its monetary sense. It would kick off other projects within the system.
Maybe more conceptually, listening to the talk and looking at all the images, I would be really interested how you see your pushing either back or developing the cohousing project forward. Because many of the images that you showed, like the illustration of GUERRILA, sort of comes out of a way of thinking that we're very aware of, and yet you were working right for ALMANAC and Cutter, so you also I guess you also know the arguments against it, and I wonder
Against Koolhaas's project.
Sorry?
Against Koolhaas's project.
Yeah, or how do we develop it forward? Because I think we are at a moment, right, where we all like it. We might be, and so how do we, like, are there ways to advance it, and how are we doing it?
Of advancing his project?
Yeah.
I think so. Most of you probably know this. Peter's always arguing that he can't be critical because you can't be outside the system if you're inside the system. In other words, he delivers the goods. And to a large extent, I'd say part of that is true, and that he kind of holds a mirror back to the culture in which he's producing his work. And Peter is trying to rent that fountain. Fred Coder is much more culturally positive and much more attuned to the real nuances between cultures, I would say, despite what most people think. He's very sophisticated about understanding certain qualities, environmental systems, things like that are consistent and produce physical cultures. A lot of his urban plans demonstrate that. I think the problem, and this is, I think, a problem for Peter more than it is for me, is Peter can only work through the paradigms of the 1940s and 50s or the kind of German art critical school that he's still defaulting to Colin Rowe. So can't see in the non-formal aspects of Koolhaas's work what that project really is about. So I still think that project then is the one that I would identify as having perhaps the most interest. And Fred Coder has said to me, because I've asked him what was, because they were contemporaries. You know, one was sort of Rose, the other was Unger's student, although they mixed in that dissonance between Rowe and Unger's is exaggerated at best. Coder finally said to me that Koolhaas was the only one who changed the Cordusian diagram. That actually he had a new way of thinking the problem through and started to acknowledge that. But I think that kind of, I mean, I can't help but seeing Koolhaas as critical in his absolute reflection of the society in which he produces, which, you know, is a tenet of certain of the more interesting avant-gardes of the 20th century, Brechtian almost, in terms of just showing you what the cultural values are, which I've always been more interested in, I guess, rather than a more utopian or slightly another kind of dystopian project. Is that?
I want to ask questions which are very close to each other, but may not be the same. One is you see the work that is some sort of a hybrid model where you're going across different fault lines, if you will, and trying to pull them together. Suggests that there's an underlying drive for synthesis in there, which is fine. The second one is an adroitness, an ability to read different shifts and different fabrics and find one's way through them. Now, they're not necessarily the same. And so I'm curious if you do see them as the same, or if does there need to be a distance or separation between the two?
Let me summarize what I understood. That there's part of the work that's sort of, I mean, the intellectual project that aims for an overall theory of it, and the work tends to swing wildly in different representations and forms.
Perhaps.
Well, it does. I mean, I'm probably one of the most inconsistent designers that I know. That, you know, I'll switch modes every 2 years, and the drawings have been really different how they're actually produced, which is probably a fault that I need to correct. But it's part, you know, when I said about the dialogue that Bob and I have had over the years, I mean, he is one of the little voices in my head. If I do it this way, then what's the critique of that, and then reverse it on the next project. So, I mean, I'm just telling you the touchstone stuff that was done in the last 5 years, and there's a whole bunch of other stuff that's completely unrelated. So, on one hand, I approach every single problem as a unique set of circumstances, materials, and potential audiences, and so the specific project aims towards addressing those issues rather than some kind of authorial presence in my own work. The struggle to come up with a theory of that then is to, both as a pedagogue, as a teacher, and as a practitioner, to identify what it is that I'm trying to get my students to do and what we're doing in the office that we would like, hopefully, to be different from how other people approach the problem. So the urban problem, which, you know, I think I said at the beginning, I stumbled into this. I had never done any city making whatsoever. I was a designer and a sculptor before that. The city was more, to me, a formal problem about between things and things themselves, like what the relations between things were rather than what the identity of an object was. So on that formal ground, it's an interest, which you could say Eisenman to some degree, Coder to a great degree, subscribe to. So if you're between objects, your identity probably is always going to be somewhat ambiguous. Thank you much. And just so you guys all know, it's always really nice to come in. There's a lot of friends I've got over the years and people who actually were students at Yale going through these kind of mental cycles with me and Fred Coder, like Andrew Trell. So I appreciate your invitation to come here and work some of these things out.